This is Rebecca from Rebecca's Sewing Corner, and today I'd like to have a look at binders with you. And to be specific, to have a look at a double fold woven and knit bias binding attachment for a cover stitch machine. Now, usually these are used for cover stitch machines, but they can also be used for regular sewing machines. However, here the focus is on using it for a cover stitch. Now, I'd like to just introduce you a little bit to the binder that we're going to be using in the course of this video. And this is let's say, a so-called branded binder. So this is sold by the manufacturer of my cover stitch machine. It's a double fold, and it is let's see if you can see that here, a 36 to 10 millimeter binder. So 36 is the input and 10 millimeters is the finished results. Now this is, I mentioned it's a branded binder, and I'd just like to turn it around, so that you get a look at it in all sort of angles, because it looks slightly different, let's say in terms of the finishing, than a generic binder. Okay, so here you see soldering points. They look very nicely. This binder is actually has a matte finish on it, so it's not polished. If I turn it over and we look at the back side, you'll also see here some soldering on the upper corner here. But in general, it's very nicely made. All of the edges, all around this are smooth. There's no places where you're really going to hurt yourself. Okay, so this is the double fold bias binder from the manufacturer of my machine. And let me put this aside for a second and take something out of my drawer, and just to show you a generic binder. Now this is a different size binder, but I did buy a generic one. This is a 2" to a 5/8 of an inch, so it's imperial and not metric. So it has a 2" input and a 5/8 of an inch output, which is slightly larger than the binder from my machine manufacturer. You can see, for example, this is polished. You can see the reflections and all the fingerprints on it. If we look at it from the top, you see that the opening here is slightly wider cut out. I'm going to turn it over and actually show you. So I have a plate mounted on this, because otherwise without a plate this one will not fit on my cover stitch machine, just because of the size and the overall depth and where these screws, where the front screws need to be put in. If you look at the soldering here, let's say it's not quite as clean, but this is basically what a generic binder could look like, so not significantly different. Okay, let me place that aside back in the drawer, and we'll continue with my 10 millimeter binder. Now, there's really a couple of important things to look at, and this helps you also identify what kind of binder you have in your hand. Now, I mentioned before that this is a double fold, and one way that you can always tell whether it's a double fold or not is if you look at these at the top and the bottom of the main body of your binder. And if you have a curve on the top and a curve on the bottom, it will be a double fold, because those are the starting points of your folds and what the binder attachment needs in order to generate a double fold. If you are missing this part down here at the bottom, and this main body part of the binder just goes straight down and ends, you have a single fold. A single fold binder, is often also called a type A, will generate a fold, and that will get folded under on the right side of your fabric, whereas on the wrong side of your fabric, on the inside theoretically, you won't have a fold, and you'll have actually just a raw edge. The advantage to that, of course, is that you have one less layer of fabric when you have finished your project. Now, there are also binders, they're called raw edge binders. They can often be used for things like fold-over elastic, FOE would be the abbreviation for that, and they have neither a curve on the top nor a curve on the bottom. So those are, let's say, the three main types of binder attachments that you'll usually run across when you're looking on the internet and trying to buy one. And I've explained the difference in how to visually see the difference between a double, a single, and a raw edge binder. So with that, I'd like to just put the binder down, and we'll move over to the next section, which is getting to know the pieces of the binder. Okay, so let's start having a look at the different sections of the binder. And I'd like to start in the back with what's often called the rake, or some people call it the snaky thing, but usually we end up calling it the rake. Now, this is a very important piece of your binder because this is really where you start feeding your strip of fabric in and getting it lined up to go into the body. Now, the rake is also an important piece of your binder because it can help determine how much tension or how much drag your strip of fabric will have. And that, in the end, also determines how your finished project will look. If you don't have enough drag on your strip of fabric, what could happen is that the fabric feeds through the binder relatively easily, and let's say that the stretch or the tension won't be quite high enough, and it could be a little bit wonky, right? So you have the possibility to weave your fabric in through this snake before feeding it into the binder, and to generate with these simple weaving, drag and tension on your strip. Now, you might have noticed that this rake is actually movable, which means that you have an additional possibility to generate even more drag, or less, on your strip of fabric. So if you pull your rake forward, you start seeing that it comes in at an angle to your actual binding attachment. And what that will do is make your strip of fabric actually drag more on this corner, creating more tension, more drag, and your strip of fabric will get stretched out a bit and be just a bit tighter on your project. Now, what you can also do is you can move this throughout your project, because sometimes if you're going around an inner or an outer curve, you might want to have a different amount of drag depending on where you are, and you have the opportunity to move this basically against the binder. Now, I'll show you this in a lot more detail when I actually put a strip of fabric into the binder so that you can see the difference, let's say, when you have the strip fed into the binder and exactly what that means. So this is the rake. It's the first part where you start feeding your fabric in, and it has a very important role because first of all, it's keeping your fabric straight and flat, and it's where the main amount of tension is generated while your strip is going through the binder. Let's have a look at the middle section of the binder. Now, the middle section of the binder, so between the rake and where the strip will come out, is really actually pretty simple, and there's not really anything that you can do there except feed your fabric through. There's a slit here in the middle where you can use your tweezers to help when you're feeding in the strip of fabric to help push it through. And I mean, the middle section is important because that's where it's starting the folds of your fabric, but there's nothing you can do other than feed the fabric through there. So we'll just stop there and talking about the middle section and move over to the front section. The front end of the binder is actually, let's say, the trickiest part of it, and where you should pay quite a bit of attention when you get your binder the first time and you're having a look at it and trying to figure it out. Because this is where your fabric strip is going to exit the binder, and it's going to go at a 90-degree angle back and through the presser foot and through your sewing machine or your cover stitch. And it's very important that, first of all, this is located on your machine properly, which I will talk about in a later section, and that the setup of these of this front section has been done properly. Now, you've probably noticed these two screws up here, and they have a very important role in all of this. But before we get to them, let's have a look at the back side, and let me explain to you two terms that I'm going to be using. Now, I often talk about the arms, and when I'm talking about an arm, I'm talking about either the upper, and right now the bottom, but the upper or the lower arm of your binder. And I think of them as arms because they're holding something up, or something is resting on them. And what we have resting or being held by these arms are what I call the bumpers. And these bumpers, they're at the end of these two strips of metal here. They are what basically provides the edge for your binding strip and helps make sure that it doesn't, extend out further and hopefully doesn't go into the inside and get wonky on you. But it's basically where the binder says this is the edge of your binding. Now, when you set up your binder to get optimum results, at least for the 10 millimeter output, I find that you need to have the bumper on the upper side all the way at the end of your upper arm. And how to determine that if it's at the end, you can really just feel it with your finger. If you go over this, you should feel no bumps or dents or anything like that. And let me take this from head on and turn it a bit so that you can really just have a look and see that this bumper section, this bumper piece right here, which is going to control the upper fold, is really just at the end. But it is resting on. It is not overextending past this arm. Now, this is important because that makes sure that it's going to remain stable. Okay. The lower bumper, if you look through the binder and you're looking down from the top, the lower bumper is approximately 2 to 3 millimeters to the right of your upper bumper. And you really need to have this distance between the two so that your machine can get set up so that your left needle is going to be right at the edge of your lower fold that's generated by the lower arm and the lower bumper. So the distance between those two bumpers, if you're looking at them from the top, and you can see this very nicely here, should be approximately 2 to 3 centimeters. Now, do note that that's applicable for the 10 millimeter finished binding attachment. But when you're setting up another binding attachment with a different width, it is important to keep in mind that the lower bumper should be to the right of your upper bumper to get really nice results. Now, I said I would talk about the screws, so let's talk a little bit about those screws. Those screws are what you use to adjust these bumpers. Now, I have found that on the majority of the binders that I've had in my hands, these screws start to adjust your bumpers very easily. Now, I'm just going to make a slight turn and show you that the bumper, let me get this over here, is already loose. Okay, I made a minimal turn and the bumper is already loose. Okay, and here you can see, let me get that right over there for you, that the bumper is already off the arm. Now, if you were to tighten that screw, the likelihood that that bumper is going to stay stable is very limited. So it's important to make sure that your bumper really is resting, that the arm is holding the bumper, and that it's right for the upper bumper right at the edge. Now, as easily as these bumpers get loose, the more difficult it is to tighten them back up. I highly recommend when you're tightening these screws back up that you're holding the bumper with your finger to keep it from moving and paying attention if you feel it moving or not. I have found that the bumper likes to move when you just very carefully tighten that screw counterclockwise. No, clockwise. So do just pay attention to it. Make sure you're holding on to it and you're feeling whether or not it's been moved or not, because you really want to make sure it's out at the end. The lower bumper, also the same way you loosen it up, you turn it counterclockwise, adjust it so you have that 2 to 3 millimeter difference that you see here, and then tighten it back up. At the same time, also holding it so that it's not going to be moving around, and you can just hold it very nicely here with the extension of the bumper. So we've had a look at what's very important about the setting of these bumpers. So don't be shy. Make sure you take your screwdriver out, loosen those up, and make sure those are adjusted properly so that you will have a chance of getting a really nice result once you get to the actual binding project. So we've had a look at the pieces of the binding attachment, the rake, the middle section, front section with the arms and the bumpers that need to get set up properly before you even start doing your binding. Now what I'd like to do with you is to actually feed a strip of binding into the binder and give you an idea of what it looks like and what to pay attention to. So I have prepared a strip of binding which I have wrapped around an empty spool or an almost empty spool of thread. I really like to use these almost empty spools with a tiny bit of thread on them to wrap my binding around, to keep it nice, to keep it flat, to keep it from getting wrinkled between the time of when I've cut it and when I actually need to use it. Because sometimes I just don't get around to it right away and I have to put things aside. So I have this pre-prepared strip. It's cut 36 millimeters wide, and I have cut it using a quilter's ruler and a rotary cutter. It is very important to make sure that you have nice and even edges and that you're cutting your strips accurately to get good results. Your binder is not that forgiving, and if the strip is too narrow or the strip is too wide, you will not get very nice results. So do make sure that you have a good setup to cut nice strips. Like I said, a quilter's ruler and a rotary cutter are usually pretty good to do that. And measure it out. Measure it at the top, measure it at the bottom, so that you know you have an accurate strip. Now I'm going to take out a bunch of the strip so that I have enough that really goes from right to left of the binder. I've got plenty of fabric to work with, and I'm actually just going to put that pin right back in to keep it from unrolling further. Because believe me, I've had that happen too, and I've had to go chase binding. Now, since we started with the rake, and that's the input section, let's start with the rake, again, with our strip of fabric. So the first step really is just to comfortably and gently weave your fabric in. Now here I'm demonstrating and I'm weaving it in through, let's say, 2 sections of the rake, and this will generate a little bit more drag than if I were just to feed it in through 1 section. Okay, and you can also just sort of loop it in like that if you want to. You don't have to actually weave it in. And so, as I mentioned, the more you weave it through here, the more drag it will have. The next step is to just simply keep pushing it into the binder. And if you have issues with it, you always take your trusty tweezers and just pull it through a bit. Now, as I mentioned when I was talking about the rake, you have the opportunity by moving the rake to generate more drag and generate more tension on your strip while you're sewing. Now, I really prefer when I'm weaving my fabric strip through to have my fabric on the front side of the rake at the last piece. And the reason for that is because I get a much more accurate drag, and I can dose it much more accurately if I have it on the front side. Now, what does that look like if I'm generating drag? I'm pulling the rake forward, right? So I'm pulling it forward. I'm pulling it towards myself while I'm setting it up or while I'm sewing. And here you see you get an angle to where it's entering into the binder, and it's really actually just pulling on this point. And this will really make a big difference in the drag and the tension of your binding strip. So even just this, let's say, approximately 45-degree angle will really make a big difference. And of course, if you really want to, you can drag it out, and you can see here the upper section, how that's really pointing out through the fabric. And this, I wouldn't do this in general, but you do have the possibility. Now I mentioned I like to have the fabric on the front side of the rake. Let me show you the difference if you have it on the back. And I just think that when you have it on the front side, you have a little bit more control and it's just a little bit more accurate. Because if I had it on the back, so it was coming off the back like this, and I'm starting to pull it forward, you see that it just kind of comes off the rake, and the angle that I'm generating is slightly different, right? So I just think you have a bit more control if you end weaving through the rake on the front side and then feed it into your binder. So let me get that back in there. And we continue on through the binder. So we've made it through the rake and the first section. Now we're going to go through the middle section of the binder. And the important part here is really to make sure that your corners, your lower corner and your upper corner, get tucked into those folds, or tucked into the piece of the midsection that's going to generate the folds. Now if you have a look, you can see they're both in there. And once you've got that far, you just go and take your tweezers in that middle slit and just pull or slightly push your binding through. Oh, it's getting stuck here in the back, so I didn't have it nice and flat. And you push your binding through until you get to the front. Now, it should go through relatively easily, and if it's not going through easily, it's either getting snagged on something, maybe your width was too wide, or you might just need to start over because something got folded up in there, which can happen. It's happened to me before as well, often enough. Now, let me show you what this looks like, because this is already very important, and you can already see the upper fold that's going to be on the right side of your project when you actually do start sewing. This curve piece of part of the S that you see here in the middle is actually going to be the outer right fold of your project. And what's very hard to see, because it's really tucked way down underneath here, is the lower fold. Okay, so I just grabbed it with my tweezers. It's really hiding kind of below there. And I'm actually just going to pull it out, okay, so that you can see it. And you can, it's stretched out a little bit, but you can see that you have all of the folds that you're expecting to have. Now, you've made it this far. Now is when you're going to need to have the fabric strip go towards the back. So you're actually feeding it then into the machine. Now I found there's two sort of standard ways to do that, or easy ways to do that. One of the most common ones, or one that's common, is actually to take the outer fold, what's going to be the outer fold or the right hand fold, with your tweezers. Just grab a hold of it and start just pulling it back through. Turn that over so you can see it back through the arms. And if you pull it slowly and carefully, the first portion of it will be a little bit wonky, as you can see, but then you all of a sudden start getting something that's nicely folded. Now let me grab a hold of this so we can turn it around and look at it from all sorts of angles. Okay, so if you look at it from the top, I'm going to take a wild guess and say, yep, that's 10 millimeters. At least I hope it is. Now I'm going to turn it over and get the back side of my hand first, and then you get the back side of the binding. And here you should be able to see your left fold from the right side of the project and your left fold from the wrong side. And you should see that they're staggered by approximately this 2 to 3 millimeters. So here it's, well, probably just shy of 2, but you can see that they're staggered, and you should be able to see that. And if you look from here, you can also very nicely see that both of these folds are up against the bumpers. Okay, and that's exactly where you want them, because those bumpers are here to help you and prevent the folds from going further to the left. Let's turn this back down and set it down. So once you've pulled it to the back, what you do need to make sure is that you pull it back far enough that it goes underneath the foot. And when you've got it back far enough, you can gently let your presser foot down and sit on this, and then you're all set. Now I said I have two ways that I like to do this, or that I think the common ways of pulling your fabric out. And let me show you the second one. The second one is actually one I prefer to do. And there, I just actually pull my fabric strip out a little bit more so that I have something to grab onto. And then I start just folding it up the way it should be when it's completed. Okay, and I do the upper fold, and I do the lower fold. It doesn't have to be too tidy. Right, and then I just do the main fold, so the one that's going to be on the right hand side. I pinch those two together and just hold them like that. So it doesn't have to be extremely tidy. And then I feed it back. So I'm forcing the fold of the strip and I'm holding on tight to it from the left hand side, where I can very nicely go back underneath my presser foot and pull it all the way to the back until I'm past the end of my presser foot, and then gently let my presser foot down on this strip. So that's what I like to do. I find it works relatively accurately, and it helps me really get in through and underneath the foot. It is very important that you pull this fabric strip back far enough and have it far enough under your foot, and I actually like to have it completely past the foot, so this edge is already past the back of my foot, so that you can ensure that when you start sewing and you start your stitches, the machine will actually not maybe get stuck on the edge or jam up or such. So it's really important to pull that all the way to the back, which also indicates, you might think about this, you do need some extra fabric on your strip to get it started and actually for the end. Because if you kept in mind that you're generating your tension on the strip with this rake, and if you have your fabric strip going in through the binder and the end of it is in here, the tension will change. I'm not saying that you can't finish your project like that, and believe me, I played chicken with it often enough, and I am able to finish it, but the results do change slightly. So if you have the opportunity, make sure that your strip is as long as what you need, plus a good couple of centimeters or inches. So I'm talking, 3-4 inches, 7-8 centimeters for the front end, and the entire length of the binder for the back end, so that you still have something, out here on your spool when you're finishing up your project, and that you have an equal tension. So I've shown you how to thread a strip through just on my tabletop. I decided to do that because I really wanted to share with you what it looks like and how to navigate through and how to get that in. And for you, when you're practicing and when you're getting to know your binder, I think it's easier. Now, I do find it difficult because the thing is moving around and it's not screwed down to my machine. But I think, for practicing and getting to know your binder, that's a great opportunity. So now we'll actually move over to putting the binder onto the cover stitch machine and what is important about alignment on the cover stitch machine. Okay, so it's time to attach the double fold woven knit bias binder to the machine. Now, most of you can probably guess, I have a Baby Lock cover stitch that I purchased for myself several years ago, and I purchased very quickly the binding attachment and learned how to use it for this machine. So the important part about attaching the binder is that it's lined up to the machine properly. Now you should have, and I need to grab those out of my drawer, received when you bought the machine the 2 magic white screws. Okay, so they look like this. They have a nice little head on them to grab onto, and they fit very nicely into these thread ports here. Okay, so now what you also might have received at one point, and I think this is also very helpful, is this little piece of plastic which has 2 holes in it, and actually those 2 holes match the front, but I use them in the back. And the reason I use them is although the binder has this sort of hump and hollow area, I find that if I try to attach it flat on the bed, it kind of really gets stuck on my foot plate. So I like to put this underneath just to get a tiny bit more height. And I put it under the front screw, and that kind of helps. You'll still notice that it, in this case, it hits the foot plate, but I find it just is a little bit more accurate and doesn't wobble around. So you need to put the 2 screws in. Now, I mentioned my machine. These binders, you can buy generic binders, and in theory, you can use any generic binder on any machine. What you do need to have is a place to attach it to. So here on this particular machine, I'll turn it around and you can see that I have a really wide front bed, and I have these 2 screws, ports to put the screws into. Now, other machines are a little bit shorter and they might not have that, so they might need an attachment plate. So there are other brands that sort of require you to buy an attachment plate. You can also get generic attachment plates. You saw that on my generic binder because I need to have that as well. There's the possibility to do that, or you get the branded plate that's specifically for your machine. Now, I mentioned that you need to make sure that the binder is aligned to your machine properly. Now, in the one of the previous sections, I spent a lot of time talking about the alignment of these bumpers and mentioning that the lower bumper will be putting your lower fold, right at your left needle. And obviously, that's kind of a tricky thing. We all know that from hemming, that sometimes it's a little bit tricky. And here you need to install something on your machine that is going to produce a result that has that lower fold lined up to your left needle. Now, what I have found that makes that a tiny bit easier are actually the needle ticks in your presser foot. So keep in mind that the 3 ticks on the front of your presser foot are aligned to your needles. So in my case, I have my machine set up on narrow left and center, which means my left needle is the tick furthest to the left. That also means when I'm looking down at the top of it, I want to have my lower bumper in a straight line with that needle tick. Okay, so when you're starting to set it up and push it around, you really just need to look for that and look at it from the front, like we're doing here, and line it up. I'm going to move it over just a tiny bit more. I think that looks pretty good. And then I'm going to tighten up my screws gently, of course, and evenly. Right, so don't just tighten up one, crank up one, and then crank up the other. Do them alternately so that you have it, have the tension equal on both screws. Now I'm going to turn up my machine a little bit, and I hope that you'll be able to see this, how they're lined up, the tick on the foot and my lower bumper. That's very important, and it will help you going forward to keep that set of information in mind, that the lower bumper should be aligned with the left needle tick. Now, another thing you've done, you might have seen that I've got a couple of magic marker marks on the bed of my machine. One thing that I've done is once I find that sweet spot, and it's actually just a tiny bit more to the left, I ended up putting a mark exactly at this lower right-hand corner of my binder. I put some tape down on my bed because I didn't want to mark up my bed, and then when I had that sweet spot of where I said, you know what, this is really a really good starting point every time I'm doing my binding, I just marked around that corner, and now I know every time I put my binder down on my machine that I need to start at the sweet spot and possibly adjust a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right from there. But it makes my life a lot easier because I don't need to guess, I don't need to look every time, and I'm a bit faster in setting up the binder when I'm working on a project. Okay, so it's getting a little bit more exciting. I'm going to now weave the strip through again and put the binding strip of fabric through the binder and feed it into the machine while the binding attachment is attached to the machine. Now, I have this little gadget over here. Let me actually push the machine back and show you this. This is something that my dear husband made for me on personal request. And this is my spool holder. This is actually just an aluminum rod that got stuck in there rather firmly, and I put a spool disc on top of it because that just spins very freely and helps prevent that there's any friction on that when my spool with the strip is turning. So I have this because I found I'm not an octopus. I only have 2 arms and 2 hands, and when I'm doing my binding, I like to have my hands over where the action is in the sewing and not trying to hold up my strip here. Okay, so I do have this strip holder. I know you can buy them off aftermarket. I don't know exactly where, so don't ask me, but I do know there's some to buy. Or you have a look at this and you say, well, Rebecca's husband could make this, so maybe mine, or maybe I can too. Anyway, so I always have this off on the right hand side, so you might see this little piece of wood and wonder what it is, but that's my strip holding tool from dear husband. So as I already did before, I'm going to weave my strip in, and I'm going to weave it in twice. I have my fabric in the front for better control of the tension if I ever want to change the tension on my actual strip. Stuff that in there with my fingers and take my tweezers and start just pulling the strip in. Okay, here, as I mentioned, you need to make sure that your corners are feeding into the folds of the midsection of the binder nicely so that they don't get stuck in there. I'm just going to keep pulling that through, pulling/pushing. It is a little bit of a push sometime until the strip comes out the front. Now, as I mentioned, there's 2 ways to do that. I prefer to pull the fabric out a little bit, fold it up by myself. Doesn't have to be too pretty and too perfect, but just so that I have my my 3 folds. Pinch it with my tweezers, maybe pull it back, and then start pulling it back. And just, I hope you can see this through the clear foot, and just start pulling my strip through. I have to release my pin on my binding holder, and just keep pulling it back all the way until my tweezers are past the end of the foot. And then I'm just going to set my foot down, and I can let go, and everything's in the machine. Now this takes a bit of practice. First of all, making sure that you always have your corners here into the folds, pulling it back. I recommend you practice it quite a bit, but basically what we've done is we've gotten ourselves ready to actually do some sewing. So I'm going to go look for a piece of fabric that I can put into this, and let's see if we can get some results. Okay, I'm back from my cutting table and have a small piece of fabric with me to attach the binding on. So I decided to just take a straight edge and go through the steps with you on that. So the first step is, of course, to not just to feed your fabric in and get going like I was just about to do, but actually it's very important to secure your first couple of stitches. So like we do when we're hemming or anything like that, you really just need to make sure that your first sets of stitches are in the fabric, that you've got it started, and you don't have any surprises later on, because there's nothing more frustrating than getting to all the way to the end of binding a neckline and realizing that the first piece of your binding, your stitches weren't secured, and you have to take it out and do it all over again. So that's very frustrating. So obviously, as always, make sure your stitches are secured. So I'm just going to take a couple of stitches here. And stop. And there's still quite a bit of space in between your needles and the binder and where you're actually going to be putting your fabric in. So to put your fabric in, you're just going to gently lay it in and push it right up into this, what's going to be the outer curve and the right curve, right hand side curve of your binding or fold, and just gently place it in with your tweezers. Make sure it's flat and just resting in there nicely. Now while you're binding, you're not going to want to put any tension, pull, push, or whatever on your fabric. You just want to guide it. Okay, so this is really a guiding exercise. But you are guiding, and as I mentioned, I like to have both my hands over here and not playing octopus and trying to deal with my binding strips. So that's why I have that nice little holder that my husband made for me. So I'm going to get this started, and I'm just going to go through and let the fabric be pulled into the machine by the project. Now don't be startled if, for example, the first couple of stitches, it doesn't start pulling it in right away, but usually it will come and basically grab onto your fabric automatically. So let's get going. So hopefully you could see that my left hand really wasn't doing anything. I just had it here and was hovering over my fabric just in case while the stitches started. And otherwise I wasn't doing anything. And my hand down here was just also just really relaxed and just letting the fabric flow through because there was nothing for me to do. It was just to make sure I'm guiding the fabric. So I'm going to guide, I'm going to continue to sew, and I'm going to sew just to the end of this little piece of fabric, and then we'll have a look at it. Okay, so I made it to the end. Now let's turn this over and have a look at our results. Now hopefully you can see this. Let me pull it up right here so it's blocking up the bright LED light a bit. And you can see that the left needle is right on the edge of this fold. It's really just right on it. And that's pretty much the sweet spot. A little bit further up, it's just off the edge, which is, let's say, more of the sweet spot. But that's, both of these, or the first section is well within tolerance, because you just really don't want to see the fold, okay? Because it doesn't look pretty, and you don't want to see it. Now, if I turn it over and we look at the front side, you also see very nice results, and you have this little fold, the left-hand fold, left-sided fold, and you have this little flap of a couple of millimeters of fabric. And that's exactly the result that you want. You want to have your left needle in a bit, but still letting you straddle with your double needles the results in the lower fold of your binding. So this came out pretty good. Got the alignment nice. Our lower bumper was lined up to the left needle, and we have the spacing between the edge that we can see and the left needle is really nice and comfy. So let's take the project out of the machine, and in this case, actually, as you can see, I'm going to swing over here with the camera, that I still have my binding strip going completely through the binder, and even still a tiny bit of binding over here on my spool. And that's really nice because that way I know that my tension has not changed while I was working on my project, if I had done anything special about the tension. Now usually when you've attached your binder, there's a little bit of space between the foot and the actual attachment, and you can get your little Swiss scissors in there, and I'm just going to cut that off and get my scissors in there. It's not agreeing with me, but I will win this, I promise you. They're not meant for left hands. Okay, and then I'm just going to sew right out to the edge and then remove the project from the machine. So I'm at the edge, erase my needles, raise my foot, and as always, to make sure you lock your stitches, because it really is important, no matter what you're doing, to lock your stitches. Pull out the needle threads, swipe under, pull them out from underneath, snip them off, and then gently pull your project back to the left and cut the looper. Once again, here are our results. Right side and the left side with the left needle lined up nice on the edge of our project. So we've reached the end of getting to know, setting up, and using the double fold knit binder. I hope you've enjoyed the time with me and the time that you spent in my sewing corner, and look forward to your feedbacks. Thank you.